Our Security Operations Center recently sent out this incident report for a malware investigation. But it's a little bit interesting because this isn't malware as you would typically expect. If we scroll down here, we can see that they note, evidence suggests that at a redacted date and time, a user operating as the system-level NT-Authority system launched an encoded PowerShell command from the executable C program files, common files, Veeam, backup and replication, mount service, Veeam backup mount service.exe. This came from Veeam. They continue on here. The encoded command reached out to an external IP address that does not appear to be related to the target and victim organization in order to download the executable C users public documents Veeam agent.exe. Now I can tell you right off the bat, and I'm sure you're led to the same conclusion, that is not the real Veeam agent executable. With all that background context, now we can take a look at the encoded PowerShell command. Obviously, this started off of cmd.exe, typically used with that cmd/c argument to note a follow-on command, and they run PowerShell with the encoded command argument, like tac-e as you might see, with this base 64. This is ran, by the way, as system, seemingly coming out of the real, genuine Veeam service, but dropping a fake, masquerading an illegitimate Veeam agent.exe. So let's decode this base 64 and make sense of what this does. I'll copy and paste this, and I'll put this into CyberChef to make it nice and easy for us, and we will want to say that is data from base 64. We can decode this, but you'll see all the output has these strange null bytes, because bear in mind, PowerShell does something a little bit different with their base 64 encoding. It is all from a different encoding of text that we will have to decode in the specific encoding format UTF-16. UTF-16 LE for little endian will give us the full value there, where it uses invoke web requests, so IWR as the usual PowerShell alias, to download from this location, HTTP IP address 129.173.120.78, port number 6969, nice, with the SDK endpoint and actually exfiltrating out a little bit of an HTTP parameter, getting the PowerShell environment variable computer name so they can keep track of past victims, and they store this output into a file, C users public documents, Veeam agent.exe, as we would have expected. And they end up starting this process with an argument list full install at the very end here. So for our own exploration, let's go see if this nefarious IP address is still online and hosting data. So in another browser tab, I'll go to that address and it returns a 404 not found. Actually, taking a look at the results here with our network tab though, if I were to reload this page, you can see that it does respond. The server is up. Actually, interesting, a Python workzerg server, so likely Python Flask hosting this. But remember, the endpoint that was downloaded from was /SDK. They included the environment variable as a host name, but because that's likely just used for victim tracking, I won't include that. I will hit enter though, and that downloads mesh.exe. Now remember, the mesh.exe that was downloaded with the PowerShell cradle was actually stored and saved with the outfile output name Veeam agent.exe. So really, our mesh.exe is what we're up against next. Now I've got this file downloaded and we can take a closer look, but before we do, there are a couple other interesting parts of the story that I want to be able to tell you. But to add some better background context, I've got to show you something cool. Let me show you Feedly Threat Intelligence. It pulls in cybersecurity news from the open web, enriches data with AI, and filters key insights to keep you ahead of threats. They just rolled out their new vulnerability dashboard to help you track new and emerging CVEs and to quickly decide whether they matter to you. Because Feedly helps you filter the dashboard against your tech stack and risk criteria to focus on only the stuff you care about. So you don't have to be juggling hundreds of updates from all over the internet. Feedly pulls real-time intel from thousands of trusted OSINT sources, consolidating everything in one place so you can stop chasing after updates and start acting on the ones that actually matter. And if you're sick of all the noise, you can filter down to exactly what impacts your stack. Whether it's by vendor, whether it's by product, attack vector, it makes zeroing in on the important stuff ridiculously easy. But here's where it gets super interesting. Each CVE comes with its own insights card, so you could actually see all the details. Everything everything you need. The proof of concept information, active exploits, threat actors, SysAkev, even malware associations, all in one snapshot. And Feedly's live CVE timeline keeps you up to date on any major changes as they happen. Oh, and there's no more waiting around for NVD updates. Feedly's AI-driven predictions can even fill in the gaps when critical details are delayed, like the vendor or the product, and even predicted CVSS scores. And if you need to push this intel to other tools or workflows, Feedly's dashboard integrates easily, and their API is fantastic. So you're not wasting time sorting through irrelevant data, you're acting on real threats fast. If you're serious about vulnerability management, Feedly's vulnerability dashboard is definitely worth checking out. Get ahead of the game and start your free trial today with the link below in the video description, jh.live/Feedly. Huge thanks to Feedly for sponsoring this video. All right, now I've got mesh.exe downloaded and in my investigation folder for us to take a look at it. If I actually right-click this to take a look at the properties, this is kind of telling. The description here is MeshCentral Background Service Agent. Okay, so something from MeshCentral. We can take a look at the Details tab, and that gives us the very same file description, but even the product name being a MeshCentral agent, product version from whatever this is, copyright Apache 2, so this is legitimate. This is a MeshCentral agent for the real, actual capability, program and solution, MeshCentral. Back over in our web browser, if you weren't familiar, MeshCentral.com leads you to this page, where MeshCentral is a solution to freely manage your devices, the open source, multi-platform, self-hosted, feature-packed website for remote device management. And it's a totally legitimate, real and trusted third-party tool for remote control. Now, I gotta say, I think this is a little bit clever. Obviously, using third-party remote monitoring and management tools is the norm for threat actors, and MeshCentral is totally one of those that could be used for this, but I don't tend to see it all that often. Just for showcase, we could totally go ahead and use MeshCentral and see just how easy it is to run commands and have basically command and control and a C2 running for any potential target or victim. The server mode that we could choose as we're installing this could be in WAN mode, where you manage devices over the internet. And ultimately, you'd need to host this publicly and externally. But for our small, short little use case here, I do just want to have this connect back to itself, just for the sake of demonstration. So let me grab my current IP address, 192.168.88.165. So we can put that here and have it call back to itself as it is trying to connect to a MeshCentral server when we have the Mesh agent installed on the client. Target or victim in this case. Once the installation is complete, we can go ahead and visit that page that will bring us to a self-signed certificate. So a little HTTPS warning, potential sketchy site, but it is something that we get to host and create ourselves. So with MeshCentral, first thing we'll need to do is create an account, an admin for us to log in and work with. And I'll just fill this out with like totally bogus, not real data. That's A-OK, password A. I'm cool with it. This is just for our learning. But look, to be able to get a callback, to be able to get our remote access Trojan and how we're weaponizing MeshCentral, just like the threat actors and malware authors might be, really, we create a device group. And that can be anything like agents, that's fine. Once we have that, we could go ahead and try to add a device. We'll need to click that link here where we could define what operating system are we going to have this run on. The target is Windows in this case, but it's wild that MeshCentral can run on practically anything. And the installation type could be background and interactive, background only, or interactive only. In our case, just like the threat actors, we probably were looking at something that's stealthy and silent. So background only would be ideal, and then we can just download a new x64 actual installer for a Mesh agent. So if I go ahead and double click on this, knowing that that's the real one for our small sandbox environment, but it looks practically identical to just as we've seen from the mesh.exe that we downloaded from the rogue malicious site. So let me try to run this go ahead and install with smart screen, whatever. I'm totally cool with it. I don't know if the background only thing worked for me, but now if I go back to the page here as that has been set up, if I refresh with F5, and you might have seen it pop up for just a second there, there's our host, Windows 11 as the agent that's connected with all the sweet details details as to what the operating system is, even a little note on our antivirus, Windows security, and the user that we have here. But we could just as easily RDP into this, maybe use VNC, or just run commands. This is wild. Whether it's PowerShell or command prompt cmd.exe, we could run as the agent itself, likely installed as system, because we did click through all of those UAC prompts, user account control, to get admin credentials, or we could run as maybe a user. And if we wanted to just enter any commands to run, I don't know, let's try to start old notepad.exe. Now, if I were to click OK and run this command, Notepad pops up. And of course, this is just local, right? We've installed the server on this host and connected the client, which is this host, to the server. So it's just running it on itself as an example. But obviously, if you had more agents connected here over and over and as many of them as you want, well, you could do anything. You could interact with the desktop. You could do specific things with a terminal that you might be able to just run commands in here, of course, running as system as we expected. Even browse files. We could connect to this and actually navigate the file system as we would our own remote access Trojan here. Keep track of events as a log as to what was going on when, details as we can see all of this doing its thing, and console in, where MeshCentral is being weaponized, used and abused, leveraged by the threat actor here as a means to have command and control over this target victim. And MeshCentral and the Mesh agent and all things in this MeshCentral world are open source, just as I mentioned. So even over on GitHub, we can go take a look at the Mesh agent and maybe learn a little bit more. Like what info, what insight can we track down since we have the threat actor's mesh.exe or their fake Veeam agent.exe, and how do they call back and connect to their specific server? We know that our executable in our small sandbox testbed knew to connect back to us, but how did they know to connect back to them? As it turns out, the Mesh agent gets its security and connections instructions from a .msh text file formatted with each line being a key equals value pair. That's generally created by the MeshCentral server, and for example, would look like this, with the mesh name, mesh type, mesh ID, server ID, and the mesh server. Now, these are things that the agent still needs to know in the first place, so they're actually bundled in and baked into the agent itself. So just for funsies, if I were to open up a terminal, let me open up and use the sysinternal suite, just because that has strings, and I'm going to keep it super dumb and stupid and easy, literally just using strings to search for whatever we might want out of this Mesh agent executable. Let's see if I can run that on my desktop investigation, and we'll have that run the mesh.exe binary, and it'll pull down a boatload of stuff. If I actually were to stop the strings output, let me try to run that again, but I will pipe it to a find string command, much like grep, but over in the Windows world. Can I look for mesh, in quotes? Fingers crossed, it'll be able to dump all this, and there we go. Now we've got some more interesting strings that'll tell us a little bit more. All the stuff pertinent to Mesh doing what it does. Looks like some snippets of code here, maybe a little bit of insight on the certificate, some of the control channel information back and forth. But at the very, very end, we actually get something interesting. We can see the Mesh name being lobby, mesh type being simply 2, and the mesh ID, the actual ID of that server, and then the server itself, using WebSockets here, but 185.238.2.165 and agent.ashx. That is the norm, by the way, for Mesh agent and MeshCentral server communication, but this IP is peculiar and especially interesting because that means it is their MeshCentral server. So what's to stop us from going back to our web browser and just taking a look at that IP address? It did say port 443, so it might be a little bit smarter to add the HTTPS schema here. But if I visit this, the exact same self-signed certificate warning. Taking a look at the advanced, go ahead and accept the risk and continue. And what do we have here? The MeshCentral server of the threat actor. Now, this is something that we can't as easily create our own account and log in with, right? We could try, and don't worry, I'm connected over VPN, whatever. You know what? Actually, I probably shouldn't put in the video me trying to log in, but it's totally possible if we could determine their credentials and maybe gain access and see what else have they compromised? What other victims, what other hosts could they have already gained this command and control over? It would be worthwhile, just as well, to see if we could put together any detectors for this sort of capability, like this PowerShell command that we know ends up running. It is ultimately still going to be some process invocation. I'll zoom out just a little bit. We can separate all these by their semicolons, and it's simple enough. We have a binary that is being executed with the same description, file information, and everything that could tie us to MeshCentral, and the arguments being tac full install. That's totally something that we could probably flag if we've got the capability to look at the signature, a little bit of the certificate, or any more of the details of that binary. So just for funsies, let's go see if we could actually have Aurora detect this. Let me get the Aurora Lite rendition, and that way we could go ahead and test if we could build out any Sigma rules. I will need an email address. Let me use the 10-minute mail. Oh, okay, cool. Thanks. And actually getting Aurora installed and all set up, when I tried to work with our local sandbox and testing mesh agent, it actually already lit up with a lot of the Sigma rules that they've already put together. Big shout out, big thanks to Nazbench. Nazardine, I'm sorry, I can never get your name right, my friend. But look, hey, you can already see it already has a Sigma rule to detect mesh agent spinning up and in action. This actually makes for a whole lot of alerts and notifications. Again, you can tune and tweak whatever rules you might like, but you can see it lighten up here. Mesh agent in the parent image, everything that it tries to do for its own setup and configuration, stuff that is worth taking a look at, and probably good to have if you do not want or do not need or do not use MeshCentral and mesh agents in your environment. That Sigma rule, along with all the other Mesh Agent and MeshCentral related things, are out and about, available online on GitHub and on detection.fyi, which is a phenomenal resource, by the way. If you haven't seen it before, I've tried to sing their praises. Very, very cool and sweet stuff, and pretty pertinent to what we're checking out now. And just as a fun aside, if we were to try to run the mesh.exe or veeamagent.exe fake actual sample from this investigation in an online and dynamic sandbox, we can see it firing off. And let me actually run it once again. If I go to that C users public, it was under documents, right? And I can run the veeamagent.exe. As this would install, we could actually take a look at the connection details, which is pretty tough to read here. Let me see if I can zoom in. Here, full screening this, not a ton of new information really, just the connection details that the agent is aware of, and everything that we already uncovered with just simple strings. Let's force install this and then see if we can get it to connect, if the threat actor will do anything spooky scary. Obviously, a lot of different file executions, all the things that we saw, even with Aurora, when we were seeing just regular stuff that happens from a mesh agent. If we take a look at the files modified, it obviously drops that .msh file where we could see, again, the same configuration and a little bit more of the details on it calling back to the malicious MeshCentral server. But we are not quite done yet, because if you remember the origin of this attack chain, the PowerShell encoded command spawning this fake veeamagent.exe came out of and was actually invoked from the real, genuine, and legitimate and actual Veeam backup and replication service. So Veeam was compromised. That was exploited, but how? Well, let's try and track down some of the other vulnerabilities that may very well have been out for Veeam. And Feedly is honestly perfect for this. If I hop over to their vulnerability dashboard, anything that we could filter down in the last 7 days or anything previous, if we wanted to adjust this. This was a relatively recent investigation, so let me change the timeline here to the last 30 days, and I'll look for any vulnerabilities, maybe from the vendor here being Veeam. We'll hit OK and add that in. And it doesn't really need to be trending. That will bring us down to a couple of vulnerabilities it looks like it found. Oh, yeah. Okay. CVE 2024-40711, a deserialization of untrusted data. Ooh, let me click into that. High severity as of September 7th. Okay. Oh, and look, yep. Unauthenticated remote code execution in Veeam products. Looks like there is one proof of concept already out and available on GitHub. Exploitation has been reported by various sources. Malware such as Akira, of course, classic Akira ransomware, have weaponized this, as well as Storm, and however you tag that. Mitigation, the timeline here gives us everything that we might need. Where are the exploits? Exploits does have a proof of concept, and Watchtower has a POC. Classic. Let's go take a look. Exploit for Veeam backup and replication, pre-authenticated deserialization. We can take a look at the affected versions here. 12.1.156 and earlier is just straight up vulnerable to unauthenticated authenticated remote code execution. And let me tell you, the affected Veeam instance in this investigation was susceptible with that version number and below, and I don't think it's too far of a hunch. We can do a little bit more digging if we need to, but this one looks a little bit clear-cut. Exploiting recent vulnerability in Veeam using a PowerShell encoded command to use MeshCentral as a command and control framework. Kind of cool. With that all said, thank you so much for watching this video. I hope you learned something new. Hope you got a little bit of cool exposure to some real tradecraft used by threat actors out and about, and using even like the legitimate, real, like third-party capability for remote monitoring and management, remote control, like MeshCentral, and seeing some vulnerabilities beat up really in the real world out in the wild. Special thanks to Feedly for even the support with this, helping out with some of the research, tracking down the vulnerabilities that were very likely exploited here. So please, pretty please, do give Feedly some love. Take a look at their vulnerability dashboard, and hey, big thanks to our sponsors, helping the channel keep doing what it does. Link below in the video description. Really hope you check them out. And with that, please do all those YouTube algorithm things, like, comment, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video.